This channel is part of the History Hit network. Stick around to find out more.
In a remote mountain desert in southeastern Utah, archaeologists unearth astonishing finds. 8,000-year-old traces of some of the earliest people in the American Southwest. But a bitter controversy overshadows the scientists as they struggle in the dust. A dark legacy from the past, which a new, high-tech breakthrough may finally dispel. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we unearth the distant past of the ancient Americans. Next on Archaeology. In the American Southwest, Native American ceremonies still flourish. Each spring, the tribes celebrate the return of the sun's warmth and the renewal of life-giving rains. Prayers are dedicated to the 4 sacred directions, marked out by the daily path of Sun Father, who illuminates the living world by day and the underworld of the dead by night. Not all the rituals are solemn occasions. Each spring, the Southern Ute tribe holds a dance dedicated to the bear, the founding figure of their culture. Some stories tell how the Utes are descended of a union between a supernatural bear and a human warrior. Though the bear dance is mainly a social gathering, and it's the young women, not the men, who choose the dance partners, it is also a sacred celebration of the tribe's origins. Behind the power and vitality of these origin ceremonies lie some challenging questions for science. Just when and how did people first begin to live in the Southwest's parched desert landscapes? How did they develop their special knowledge of survival, passed down across generations? The clues lie buried here, in a cave site high up in a desolate Utah canyon where prehistoric people lived, hunted, and were buried from 20 to 80 centuries ago. But special problems loom for Southwestern archaeologists. They must contend with the reckless looting of sites by pot hunters and collectors who churn up the soil layers so crucial to the archaeologist's understanding. And science also faces the opposition of many Native Americans, increasingly angry that archaeologists continue to disrupt the long sleep of their ancestors. But archaeology itself has not been blameless in the plundering of the Southwest. Digging in the name of science, scholars have treated the remains of ancient Americans as objects for clinical study, not reverence. Today, with the help of new technology and under the watchful eye of Native Americans, they are discovering that science need not disturb the spirits of the dead. It is a desolate, unforgiving land. To survive here, you need long experience and special knowledge of the desert's hidden resources. Here, the rainfall averages only around 14 inches a year, falling mostly in unpredictable thunderstorms in June and July, often as sudden destructive flash floods. A flood races quickly over rock-hard soil, leaving it almost as bone-dry as before. Despite precarious conditions, prehistoric farmers raised corn in canyons which are now arid, desolate, far from any modern habitation. They left evocative ruins of pueblos, the builders known to us in legend simply as the Anasazi, or Old Ones. Today we have a good idea of what happened to the Anasazi. Intense drought forced them to abandon most of their sites only a couple of centuries before the Spaniards arrived, and their descendants are living in the modern pueblos of today. But still the questions linger. Who came before the Anasazi? And how did people live before there was corn?
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. Our extensive catalogue of documentaries covers everything from the rise of Hannibal Barca to the illustrious treasures of King Tut. So sign up today for broadcast quality documentaries uncovering the mysteries of the ancient world. Not only that, but we have a huge podcast network releasing new episodes every day, so you'll always have something to listen to. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and Odyssey fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Odyssey at checkout.
Ancient images carved on the canyon walls seem to tell us of an older, legendary time before farming, when the hunting way of life first drew people into these barren canyons. To get enough to eat, the hunters led a mobile existence, sheltering in caves for a few months of the year before moving on. This was one of their stopping places. Old Man Cave near Blanding, Utah. Here, Phil Geib, an archaeologist working for the Navajo Nation, and Dale Davidson of the Bureau of Land Management, direct a team of volunteers searching for elusive traces of those early hunters, known to archaeologists as the archaic culture. It's a rare opportunity. The archaic is one of the great unknowns in southwestern archaeology.
If you think about the number of archaic sites that anybody has dealt with here in the Southwest, the number in this part of the Southwest is like 3 or 4 sites total. You know, and we've how many Pueblo sites have been dug here? Thousands and thousands. So it's a really, to work in a place like this, it adds a real important dimension.
In part, it's a preservation problem too. Here we have wonderful preservation. We're in a shelter, and these early deposits have been totally preserved. They haven't been flushed away. A site like this, of this age, 8,000 years ago, if it was out in the open surface out here in the valley, has a good chance of either eroding away or being buried by other deposits, so it's totally invisible to archaeologists, and we have a hard trouble locating those kinds of sites. Here, the materials is preserved, and it's preserved so well that we have organics, yucca and grass fiber that date back 8,000 years ago, or about 8,000 years ago.
It was an unusually well-preserved object that first alerted them to the potential of the site. On a visit to the vaults of a local museum in 1988, they spotted a sandal woven from yucca fiber that had been collected from the surface of the cave. They had once suspected that the site must have remarkably intact remains from the archaic, but when they hiked to the cave, they found it riddled with the holes of collectors and pot hunters.
As you can see all around us, this part of Old Man Cave has been very heavily disturbed by looters in the past. Maybe as long ago as before the turn of the century, in the 1880s and 1890s. Maybe only a matter of a few years ago.
The 1880s and 90s were the heyday of the collectors who ransacked sites to fill museums back east. Richard Wetherill and his 4 brothers were Colorado cattle ranchers who led an expedition in 1893 into the tortuous canyons of Utah's Grand Gulch. At a single cave, Wetherill unearthed 97 skeletons in 4 days, shipping them back east to museums where the bones still lie boxed up, virtually unstudied to this day. Though his methods were crude, Wetherill was one of the first to record his finds with notes and photos. And he realized that the Anasazi were not the first visitors to the site.
There are some of the early relic hunters that I like to think of as archaeological explorers rather than vandals, because they were practicing the archaeological science of the day, if you will. We wouldn't do science like that. We wouldn't do archaeology like that anymore. But I think that they're in a different class than people who were just here to get some pots to sell, or some blankets, or all the other wonderful things these sites contain.
While pot hunters still plunder dozens of sites in the Southwest each year, archaeologists have changed their methods drastically. New remote sensing technology allows them to plan exactly where to dig beforehand and see beneath the soil without even lifting a spade. Today's archaeology is indeed different from the old days. High technology will allow Dale and Phil to see beneath the soil before they even lift a spade, thereby allowing them to avoid disturbing human remains.
Right across this area, right through here.
First, they stake out a reference grid that will help them pinpoint the location of any buried features seen by this device. It's an antenna that transmits a ground-penetrating radar signal into the Earth. Similar in principle to an earthquake detector, but with a much higher frequency signal, which will bounce off anything unusual underground.
For example, if a pit has been dug and then afterwards covered up, and the ground-penetrating radar passes across that point, the place where the pit has been covered will be different from the surrounding soil that has not been disturbed. Once the natural soil profile is disturbed, it stays disturbed, and it's something that the GPR instrument system can find and determine.
So the machine picks up reflections from disturbed soil, buried rocks, objects, or bones, and the fraction of a second it takes the signal to bounce back tells the machine how deep the object or layer is. The result? A continuous map of the hidden world beneath their feet. They can review the map on the spot, but in a computer lab, the radar record is even more revealing.
This particular line here, you can see the normal geology, and again there's a disturbed zone, and this disturbed zone has the normal geology above it, so it's another place that was disturbed a long time ago. The geology had time to settle in above it, and this is something that should be dug up by the archaeologist and investigated. It's probably a very interesting undisturbed site. The pot hunters haven't found it yet.
So like eyes beneath the soil, the radar helps them plan the dig. They know in advance where to expect ancient pits, burials, or pot hunters' holes. Early morning in Combe Wash. It's already 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will be 100 by noon. A team of volunteers from the Four Corners School begins the quarter-mile trek up to Old Man Cave. But there are always surprises once they finally begin to probe the soil. The exceptionally dry conditions in the cave have preserved materials that would normally be destroyed, such as fragments of an 8,000-year-old sandal woven from yucca, nearly identical to the one in the museum that led Phil to the site in the first place.
So here's the sandal fragment. Now that we took it out of the deposit, there's still sediment underneath here, ashy charcoal sediment. And it's actually resting on top of a mono fragment, something they would have used to grind small seeds with. They threw it out in the trash. It's just part of the trash deposit. And it's just fortuitous that it's resting on the mono. You can see how the loop here is draped over the surface. Very open sort of sandal. They usually packed it with grass or juniper bark to make it a little more comfortable. Quick to make, though. An experienced person could make one of these in one sandal in perhaps about 10 minutes or so. So they're sort of a disposable technology.
But what was life really like for the people who wore the sandals 8,000 years ago? R.G. Matson of the University of British Columbia is an authority on these ancient desert dwellers.
The archaic people here, the ones who lived here 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, made their living by hunting and gathering. They probably hunted a wide range of animals. We have remains of deer, for instance, in this cave. And they also gathered a number of different things.
To recover animal bones, seeds, and other evidence of diet, the excavators carefully sift each bucket load through a fine mesh screen, even though it kicks up a choking dust.
The one gathering thing that we have a lot of evidence for is spirabolus, or dropseed grass. And the other two sites of this age also have lots of evidence of dropseed grass. So that was one of their staples. They probably moved very frequently over the landscape, so that they never stayed in an area more than a few weeks at a time. So they cleaned out the resources in an area, the animals, the plant resources, and then they'd move on to another area. But they probably made fairly regular annual rounds.
Surprisingly, clues about the archaic people even come from the vegetation surrounding Old Man Cave today. Nancy Coulomb of the U.S. National Park Service is a botanical expert who is comparing present-day plants with the evidence of those consumed by the cave dwellers 8,000 years ago.
the big question for us is, what was life like for these people? And a big chunk of that life is going out looking for plants. And so we need to know how far on a daily basis did people have to travel to go get lunch and dinner.
The remains of ancient lunches and dinners are right here in the dirt. The excavators are probing a prehistoric hearth. They will sift it for traces of ancient pollen and seeds.
So we are picking up the results of prehistoric accidents in the kitchen. And by looking at lots of those accidents from different hearths all across a site and then all across a region, we can determine fairly well what people are cooking. These people had a tremendous impact on their environment, and they created the environment to some extent that we see around us today. They ripped up whole plants. It's really common. What you find is you find whole grass clumps that they have ripped out of the ground and brought back to their cave, and they then extracted the seeds there. They were not exactly ecologically minded.
So did they thoughtlessly strip whole canyons of their vegetation and then move on? Or did they carefully protect or even propagate the wild grasses so crucial to their survival? Someday soon, science may have the answer. The American Southwest is a storehouse of archaeological treasures. A conservative estimate would be 500,000 sites. But that rich legacy is darkened by continuing vandalism, ruthless robbing by collectors and pot hunters, and contempt for the remains of ancient Native Americans buried at the sites.
Vandals like to express what they do as not being grave robbing. You know, they're looking for artifacts, they're doing anything else, but they're not grave robbing. But in fact, the kinds of artifacts they look for in the modern day, pots, blankets, the things that they can find a most ready market for, are from graves. So there's no way that that you can come to any other conclusion than they're grave robbers. That's right. And anyone who do that is showing the worst kind of disrespect that I can think of.
In their work at Old Man Cave, the archaeologists have already used ground-penetrating radar to alert them to likely burial places within the cave. But as they begin digging down through the layers, they come across obvious signs of a prehistoric human grave dug into the site long after the period of the archaic hunters.
We started an excavation unit right here, 1 meter square, and just shortly into it, we discovered there was a break in the strata with a pit, an intrusive pit feature. After a little bit of exposing, we realized we had a knee of an individual interment that had not been looted yet by the pot hunters. Once we discovered it was a burial, we shifted over our excavation to here because we're not interested in disturbing human remains. We were interested in getting down to the early archaic deposits. So we shifted our unit over and kept going down. And then we encountered this other feature here, which is a rock-lined pit that also starts up at the Basket Maker 2 level. It might be a burial as well, and so we wanted to stay away from it. And so we were sort of caught between two areas here, and so we had to cut around both of them and excavate down. Native Americans find it terribly offensive for archaeologists to be digging up their ancestors or, anyone who is Native American and treating them like objects of study, not treating them as with reverence or not treating them as human remains, but treating them like artifacts, essentially. At this site, we've tried to be sensitive to that. We've tried to avoid the human remains to the extent possible, and we haven't been purposely excavating for them. When we find them, we've had to move our excavation to try to avoid them. We have surface collected all the remains that were disturbed and left around here from previous looting at the site and reinterred them in a specific spot. At some point, they might get proper reburial if we can notify, the appropriate tribes that would be interested in such a practice or a rite of reburial.
But what about the tens of thousands of Native American skeletons still boxed up in museum storerooms? A recent statement by the organization American Indians Against Desecration concludes, with 500,000 of our ancestors in laboratories, museums, and universities, we suggest it is now time to have some serious discussions on the meaning of respect.
There have been hundreds and hundreds of bodies that have sat around in museums for 100 years or more and have not received very much study. So it's hard to defend a position when you haven't done anything with all these existing collections. Oh, why do you need more? It's a matter of equal treatment. We treat Anglo graves one way, we treat Indian graves another way. And it's just a matter of trying to bring the two together so we have equal treatment. And it's not a bigoted way of approaching life.
The lives of today's Pueblo peoples speak to us of an extraordinary centuries-old heritage, founded on reverence for the Anasazi ancestors who, like them, must have celebrated the return of the sun and the life-giving rains. Today, science has taught us much about those ancestors and about the still earlier hunters of the archaic. Often, our knowledge has come at the expense of Native American values. Pot hunters and vandals continue to threaten the ancient graves. But with the help of sophisticated remote sensing technology, archaeologists can now excavate a site without destroying or even touching skeletal remains. Now, perhaps, a new way forward for archaeologists in the Southwest is possible. For tens of thousands of years, the Neanderthals roamed Europe's bleak grasslands, braving cave bears, mammoths, and the freezing winters of the Ice Age. And then they vanished. Their disappearance has stirred a debate and speculation for over a century. Still, the mystery lingers. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we explore the prehistoric world of Neanderthal, next on Archaeology. Imagine it is 100,000 years ago. An ice sheet 1 mile thick grinds over Scandinavia and Siberia. Most of Europe is an endless expanse of prairie with howling winds and stunted vegetation. In the sheltered valleys, the Neanderthals huddle under cliffs and in cave mouths, hunting some animals familiar today, while facing others now extinct. The fearsome cave bear, cave lion, giant bison, and woolly mammoth. For untold generations, the Neanderthals had Europe to themselves. Then a new, modern type of human began developing and spreading slowly from Africa. For centuries, Neanderthals and moderns coexisted, apparently in peace. Then, the Neanderthals vanished.
Why did the Neanderthals as a group die out, and why did modern humans become the only form of humans that are around? We don't have all the answers to that question. It's a very difficult question to answer, but it's one where we're starting to get a series of leads from research into the fossils and research into the archaeology, the debris that they left behind.
Our fascination with this beetle-browed fellow has not dimmed in the 150 years since we first made his acquaintance. Artists have given him his human face. Physical anthropologists are trying to make him walk and talk again. And the enduring question of his relationship to us remains. Did Neanderthal and modern man coexist in peace or conflict? Did they go their separate ways? Could they have interbred? Only one thing seems clear from the archaeological record. The life of a Neanderthal was not an easy one. In 1856, a human skeleton was found in a cave in the Neander Valley in Germany. Its discovery began a century-and-a-half argument over the Neanderthals. At the turn of the century, archaeologists and collectors ransacked the cliff sites of southwest France, hunting for Neanderthal bones. The first attempt at a scientific study of this find from La Chapelle was a disaster and misled a whole generation. This 50-year-old Neanderthal's bones were deformed by arthritis, but they led a French scientist to declare that all Neanderthals were stooping hunchbacks with bow legs who couldn't walk straight. The image of the brutish caveman was born. How could such a pathetic creature have possibly survived the rigors of the Ice Age? In reality, scientists have begun a more realistic effort to flesh out the fossil bones. They're using the latest forensic techniques to bring us a true portrait of the Neanderthals, the same techniques police use to identify missing people. Medical artist Michael Anderson first needs his own copy of the La Chapelle skull. To do that, he's made a mold of the skull.
This is a 3-piece mold. Eye sockets out. And there's the cast. It's an exact copy of the original. And that's our final cast. The Neanderthal skull is similar to modern human skulls, and the measurements of the Neanderthal skull fit within the range of modern human populations. But there are some unique qualities to Neanderthal skulls, some of which are, it has a low forehead and high brow ridges here. It also has a large nasal opening. This is characteristic of Neanderthals, and this recessed chin. They don't have a pointed chin like a lot of skulls do in modern human populations.
With the aid of a modern anatomy text, Anderson carefully applies clay to reproduce the exact shape of the muscles that were once attached to the Neanderthal skull.
The muscles on a Neanderthal skull are exactly the same as what you find in a modern human skull. Pathologists have determined that this individual was about 40, in his 40s, which is quite old for a Neanderthal, and he had 2 teeth left in the skull. And this led researchers to believe that he couldn't take care of himself anymore, and it just also points out that life was quite hard for the Neanderthals, and hence I tried to put in some of the gray in the beard, the salt and pepper look. But most likely this person would have had scars on his face and would have been beat up quite a bit, and this is a fairly pristine view of it. But I think that this portrait would have been recognized by members of the tribe, though, in the Neanderthal tribe.
And here is the entire Neanderthal, reconstructed by Anderson with the same meticulous forensic techniques. The ancient bones no longer give us an image of depravity and brutishness, but a startlingly familiar one of vigor and muscularity.
First of all, one of the first things that you notice when you look at a Neanderthal, whether a reconstruction of a Neanderthal or just look at their bones, is they were extremely massively built. For example, the attachments for their pectoral muscles, what bodybuilders call pecs, were about twice the size of those of modern humans. They had the physique of a mystery universe without having to work at it. They all had it. It was part of their everyday existence. They did it for survival, not to win world contests. One of the problems with being so strongly built is, again, it's energetically very costly. It's like an athlete in training. You have to take in a lot of calories, and which puts the Neanderthals in a vicious circle. They have to take in a lot of calories to maintain these powerful bodies. In order to take in those calories, they have to be very active and go out and get lots of food, and it's a cycle, the vicious cycle that builds on itself.
Why were the Neanderthals built like Mr. Universe? There's a clue in the stone tools they made.
These are complex tools that require a lot of dexterity to make. Neanderthals made these, but what they resulted in were either handheld tools, like holding a knife by the blade rather than with an effective handle, or spears that were thrusting spears that were not very effective at throwing. They didn't have anything like a bow and arrow, so they would have had to get into close quarters, probably through an ambush, to bring down prey the size of a deer, which they did do.
So their limited tools put a premium on strength and fitness, sculpting the mighty muscles which left their marks on the bones. But these same bones also tell a grimmer story of constant threats to the Neanderthals as they struggled for existence. Next, in the search for the Neanderthals. The bones of the Neanderthals tell a harrowing tale of the risks they faced in the perilous prehistoric world of the Ice Age.
They have broken bones on their faces. They have broken arm bones, foot bones, hand bones. They have breaks, bruises, bad sprains, pretty much everywhere, as long as they were able to keep moving. And what is very interesting is that the distribution of breaks in their bodies is very similar to the distribution of fractures that you find in rodeo riders, especially bull riders and the like. And what this suggests is a lot of close encounters of a nasty animal kind. The trauma, the growth defects, the low life expectancy, all of it suggests to us that Neanderthals were having a tough time, and that any modern human population that moved into the area, that for whatever reason, whatever organizational or technological reason, was able to increase their life expectancy, to increase their survivalship of infants, of children, of adolescents. Any even very subtle increase in that, in those demographic aspects of their populations would lead over a few thousand years to a complete replacement of Neanderthal populations.
But it wasn't just physical risks that put Neanderthals at a disadvantage. Lewis Binford, who's studied Neanderthals for nearly 30 years, thinks more subtle aspects of behavior made them less able to cope with change than modern humans. One difference seems to have been their inefficient use of fire.
Modern man has, let's say, relatively poor fuels in a fuel-scarce environment. He'll bring in stones, he'll start a fire. As combustion goes on, the stones heat up that he puts in the fire. Then after the fuel is burned down, he's still got radiant heat. He can move those warm stones into a sleeping area or whatever, and they appear in the archaeological site as fire-cracked rock. There isn't any such material in Neanderthal sites, yet they were living in severe environments in which this would have been a very useful tactic to have had. They didn't do it.
But if Binford is right, there was a more fundamental problem. A failure to plan ahead, to take advantage of predictable seasonal events, like an annual salmon run.
It's very hard in Neanderthal sites to find many salmon bones in environments where you pretty well know there were salmon, because the salmon bones are in the feces of bears that were contemporary. So they basically seem to be exploiting the environment on an encounter basis rather than on a planned schedule or a tactical basis, which is really what we do quite well.
So did Neanderthals die out because they were unintelligent? The skulls tell us that Neanderthals had brains as big as ours, sometimes even bigger. The question is, how were they using them?
I think Neanderthals were smart, just that the way in which their intelligence was organized and in terms of what it made possible was perhaps a bit different. That their behavior was exactly like us, or just sort of a watered-down version, or a kind of group of people who needed a Head Start program to make them like us. I think that's perhaps romance, because it doesn't address the issue, what were they really like? And that's what we'd like to know, and a lot of people are trying to find out.
What were the Neanderthals really like? In the continuing quest for their identity, new clues have surfaced about the unusual relationships between Neanderthal men and women. For 100,000 years, Neanderthals endured their brief, hard lives. Then modern man emerged, first in Africa and gradually spread throughout the Near East and Europe until about 35,000 years ago, there were no more Neanderthals left.
There seems to have been a lot of intermixing in areas like Central Europe, probably less in Western Europe, but the whole thing seems to have been peaceful. And even in Western Europe, where the Neanderthals seem to have died out largely without issue, they probably were simply outcompeted for resources.
The question is, were they just a side branch, a dead end with no relation to us? Or does every one of us walk around with traces of this strange type of human in our genes?
The issue of how much genetic material we may have shared with the Neanderthals is perhaps put in perspective better by some of the biological chemists who point out that we share about 95% of the genetic material with chimpanzees. So we certainly share an awful lot, even if there was no crossbreeding with the Neanderthals.
If we shared so much, why did the Neanderthals and their way of life die out? Lewis Binford thinks peculiarities of Neanderthal behavior doomed them to die out. And nothing was more peculiar than the relationship between Neanderthal men and women.
Were they organized like us into basic families in which males and females cooperate in support of the young and help feed one another and stuff? Of course, this is something we'd like very much to know.
From the Neanderthal site of Combe-Grenal in southwest France, Binford draws an extraordinary conclusion. Men and women, he thinks, led largely separate lives, foraging outside the cave and eating most of what they encountered on the spot. There was little bringing back of food to share. That vital human institution, the family, seems to be missing.
I think we have to imagine that much consumption is done individualistically and where it's encountered. And those things that are brought back to the cave are primarily things that require processing, breaking open, heating, or something like that. So that we're not seeing a normal picture of a family coming home for supper. This is also borne out by the kinds of species that we find in different places in the cave. And the frequency with which we think we have some ability to recognize what is male and female, which is arguable, but there's certainly kind of dichotomy in the site, suggesting that females may well be on their own much of the time, and males come in periodically, but they're not permanently associated as a mixed-sex group.
Was cooperation between men and women a key advantage that modern humans had over the Neanderthals? An advantage that pushed inefficient Neanderthals into oblivion? Many disagree with Binford and point to evidence suggesting a concern for family. In fact, a Neanderthal mind hauntingly like our own.
The Neanderthals were the first humans to intentionally bury their dead. We have about 24 burials of Neanderthals, from little children to old adults, men, women, boys, girls. Burying a family member who dies, whether it's a child or an adult, says that you care about that person, that that person has a specific social role in the group, that that person is important, and for the memory of that person and to, in a sense, readjust the roles, the social roles of the people within that group, you go through some kind of a ritual, what we call a funeral.
The argument that they cared for wounded persons or aged individuals, and that proves that they had a kind of emotional or more spiritual orientation to the world. I'm not so sure that that's totally convincing. Many other animals tolerate or even care for or help support disadvantaged animals on occasion. Other primates do this. There's a beautiful example from the macaques in Japan of a congenitally disadvantaged individual that made it and reproduced children and so forth. So that kind of evidence is not that convincing.
They moved, they walked, they handled objects, they spoke language just as capably as any of us do. They may have had a slightly different accent than we do because they had larger mouths with larger faces, but basically, if you tried to teach them Chinese or English or French or Swahili or whatever, you wouldn't have any trouble doing it. They were perfectly capable of speaking modern human languages.
But Lewis Binford thinks that it was modern humans who had the first effective language.
This is not to be confused with communication. I'm sure the early guys had good communication systems, nor necessarily speech or the ability to articulate sound. That could be a communication system. The issue is how it's organized.
So what really happened when Neanderthals, perhaps disadvantaged in speech, technology, and food gathering, encountered fully modern humans?
Of course, it's interesting to speculate, particularly based on the Western European data, where we have some suggestion that Neanderthals were probably around at the time that also fully modern man was around.
They gradually spread, they intermixed with the Neanderthals, they produced offspring with them who would have ancestors both of Neanderthal and modern human biology or anatomy, and that the resultant populations would then spread further west and further north, eventually establishing what we call early modern humans and leading to the eventual disappearance by 35,000 years ago of what we call Neanderthals.
How ironic that the ancient people once depicted as subhuman brutes must have made a contribution to the genes of all of us living today.
There are no Neanderthals alive today, but the Neanderthals did not die out without issue. They passed on their genes, they passed on offspring that themselves became the ancestors of modern Europeans.
So we have given Neanderthal a human face, and in many ways it looks startlingly like our own. They cared for their sick and their injured in a world fraught with disease and danger. They gently buried and mourned their dead, and they probably looked forward to a better life in the next world. But they could not see beyond their day-to-day, hand-to-mouth existence. In the end, this lack of foresight may have killed them off. Perhaps we, their successors, would do well to remember that.